What's happening, guys? How's it going? So a bit of a random video here today. This is sort of a retrospective video that I had the idea to do. And the reason why I was sort of inspired to do this video is because earlier today I watched a really interesting video that was posted up on Sky Sports' YouTube channel. Now, if you guys have been paying attention to sort of the YouTube boxing community, one video that's been very popular over the past few days is this video from Sky Sports, which was an old Gloves Are Off episode that was initially recorded in 2013. However, they decided to, this week, upload it to their YouTube channel. And I decided to check it out, and it was a really fascinating watch. And if you guys haven't seen it, because I didn't know about this at the time, because I don't have Sky Sports, so I didn't know that this particular Gloves Are Off episode existed. So I didn't know about it until watching it yesterday. But it's a fascinating watch, and when I watched it yesterday, I really enjoyed it, and it kind of inspired me to make this video, and I'll talk about that now. So, why I wanted to make this video is because as I was watching that, so they had four or five super middleweights, guys who are retired from the super middleweight division. They had Roy Jones, they had Joe Calzaghe, they had Steve Collins, they had Richie Woodall, who was a former champion, and they also had Chris Eubank. So yeah, there was five guys sitting around the table. It was being hosted by Johnny Nelson, and yeah, those five guys were all at one point in time a super middleweight champion. Now, when this was initially recorded, and I mentioned this was recorded in 2013, you guys might recall that that was around about the time that Steve Collins was trying to get Roy Jones into the ring, despite the fact that Steve Collins had been retired for many, many years. And Roy was still active at that point. He's retired now, but he was still active back in 2013. And Steve Collins was trying everything he could for a good few months to try and negotiate a comeback fight against Roy Jones, and it was quite funny. And I've got to say, man, throughout this entire Gloves Are Off episode, all the interviews and all that was being said and all the back and forth between the guys, definitely for me, the guy who stole the show and made it the most entertaining was Steve Collins. And the most entertaining part of that segment, with Steve Collins going back and forth with people, was when Chris Eubank decided to sort of interject himself into the conversation, because basically Steve Collins was roasting Roy Jones for the fact that he didn't fight him, because if you guys don't know, back when Roy Jones and Steve Collins were both fighters at super middleweight, Steve Collins was the WBO champion. He really wanted to fight Roy Jones. That was a guy he was calling out non-stop. He showed up at a couple of Roy Jones fights and essentially gate crashed some of Roy Jones' post-fight reviews, and he really wanted to fight Roy Jones. And you got the sense from listening to him in this interview that even to this day, he is obsessed with the idea of fighting Roy Jones. Like it's his biggest regret of his career that he didn't get to prove himself and fight Roy Jones. And Chris Eubank essentially was calling, he was calling Steve Collins out and insinuating that Steve Collins was a hypocrite because although Steve Collins was roasting Roy Jones for essentially ducking him, Chris Eubank was insinuating that Steve Collins did the same thing to Joe Calzaghe, because you guys might recall when Steve Collins was WBO world champion, he was set to fight Joe Calzaghe in 1997. However, Steve Collins pulled out of the fight last minute. I believe just 2 weeks or so before the fight, he pulled out and never really gave an explanation why. And Chris Eubank, of course, was the guy who stepped in at late. He stepped in late. He stepped in at short notice to fight Joe Calzaghe and got a beating and lost the fight. And basically, Chris Eubank, was trying to call Steve Collins a hypocrite, and he was trying to just insinuate that Steve Collins wasn't innocent in the matter and stuff like that. And Roy Jones, funnily enough, pointed out towards the end of the episode, Roy Jones sort of called up Chris Eubank and said to Chris Eubank, he's like, do you know why you're so heated in this debate? You know why you don't feel the tension between me and Steve? It's because you still hold a certain amount of tension and resentment between you two, because of course Chris Eubank himself got his arse kicked twice by Steve Collins, and you could definitely tell that there's a certain level of resentment there, like a certain level of animosity. You could really tell that Chris Eubank does not like Steve Collins and is still to this day a little bit bitter about what happened. So I found the whole episode really, really fascinating, man. There's so much pent up bitterness between everybody. Even Joe Calzaghe himself seemed a little bit just a little bit begrudging towards Steve Collins for the fact that Steve Collins never fought him. And then when Steve Collins finally revealed that he had a foot injury, but he sort of contradicted himself, because he also said that he just couldn't get up for the fight and that he wasn't really interested in Joe. We didn't know who Joe was and stuff like that. And you could just sense the atmosphere. It was a really, really fascinating watch. And like I said, if you guys haven't seen it, I would really recommend you go and watch it. It's about 25 minutes, something like that, but it's totally recommended. Really, really fun episode. It was definitely the best episode of The Gloves Are Off that I could recommend. And basically, it got me thinking. And what I ended up doing for the rest of that night and for most of today, because I've really had a lot of time on my hands today, and I've been watching non-stop videos of Steve Collins. I decided to go back and watch a shit ton of Steve Collins fights. Now, I have seen a lot of these fights in the past where I've watched them online, but the thing is with Steve Collins, he was a fighter who was kind of before my time. You know, when I was a young boxing fan growing up watching the sport, I was a big fan of several of the top British fighters. Like, my heroes were people like Joe Calzaghe and Ricky Hatton, fighters like that. Whereas Steve Collins, who was of course from Ireland, you know, he was an Irish fighter, but weirdly enough, he did actually end his career in my hometown. He ended up his career in Glasgow. That was where he had his final fight. And yeah, he was from Ireland, but he was before my time. Like, he retired long before I started watching boxing. Again, he retired in 1997, where he pulled out of the Calzaghe fight, and yeah, he never went through with it. And I didn't start watching boxing until several years after that, you know, because I was too young at the time. But yeah, Joe Calzaghe was definitely the man when I was watching boxing as a kid. So I didn't really have a lot of first-hand experience of who Steve Collins was as a fighter. Like, I never really knew that much about him. I wasn't too familiar with his resume or his record. So it kind of, watching this back and forth between Steve Collins and these other super middleweights, it really made me want to look into him as a fighter and try and assess how good was he. Because when you listen to sort of retrospective talk about the middleweight division and the super middleweight division, you hear a lot about Chris Eubank, you hear a lot about Nigel Benn, but you don't really hear a whole lot about Steve Collins, who was a guy who beat both of them twice. And I want to talk about that. So, how good was Steve Collins as a fighter, and was he better than those guys prime for prime? And how would he have done had he gotten the fight against Roy Jones? Like, if that fight had happened back in the 90s, what would have happened? Would he have had a chance against Roy Jones, or would it have even been competitive? And not only that, but another thing that really intrigues me, and this is one thing that I've been going over, you know, back and forth in my mind over, because I can't really seem to make my mind up. What would have happened if Steve Collins had fought Joe Calzaghe in 1997? Like, if Steve Collins had decided to go through with the fight, if there was no foot injury, you know, if he had the desire, you know, the desire and motivation to fight Joe Calzaghe, how would that fight have gone? Because I think that's a really interesting thing to talk about, and I'll talk about it in a few minutes. But essentially, Steve Collins, to me, looking at his career and what he achieved, he was middleweight champion. You know, he was the WBO middleweight champion, and then of course he moved up in weight to challenge Chris Eubank for the super middleweight title. Now, earlier in his career, he had several defeats. He was defeated by people like Reggie Johnson, for example, Mike McCallum. However, he was never stopped. He always shown a great chin and great durability. And if you look at some of Steve Collins' early fights, like fights before he became champion, you know, and before he fought for titles and whatnot, he was a very technically good fighter, you know, very elusive, a good counterpuncher, decent athlete. However, towards the end of his career, so when he moved up to super middleweight, he became more well known for his durability and his toughness and being able to pressure you and just grit his way to victory. And that was sort of how he essentially became so well known. You know, he became known for his durability and his toughness. And if you look at a few standout fights, because obviously the standout fights on his resume were, of course, against Chris Eubank and Nigel Benn. If you look at those fights, it's really interesting. I like to challenge popular narratives. Now, the narrative is that he got those guys at the right time, that he essentially fought those guys when they were coming towards the end of their careers, and that if he'd have fought them earlier, he wouldn't have beaten them. Personally, and this is just my personal opinion, based on what I've watched of, and again, I've watched pretty much everything that's out there on Steve Collins and on Chris Eubank and on Nigel Benn. I'm very familiar with them as fighters and with their styles. I completely disagree with that narrative. Now, first of all, when he fought Chris Eubank in the first fight, now going into that fight, Chris Eubank was the WBO champion. He was coming off a string of victories. That was part of his world tour, where he was fighting all over the place. And he was coming off, I believe it was a victory against, was it Henry Wharton? I think he beat prior to fighting Steve Collins. And he went over to Ireland to fight Steve Collins. And going into that fight, Eubank was a favourite. And not only that, but he was actually 2 years younger than Steve Collins. So I don't understand this narrative that Chris Eubank was somehow a shot fighter and that Collins got him at the right time. I don't necessarily agree with that, and I'll explain why. If you look at how that fight went, and ignore the official scoring, because I've got to be honest, the official scoring for that fight and for the rematch was a flat-out disgrace. I don't know what was going on there. That fight wasn't competitive, even in the slightest. Steve Collins, from the very opening bell, from the first round, he comprehensively and decisively outboxed, outlanded, outworked, and outscored Chris Eubank. And if you look at the way the fight ended up, like towards the end of the fight, because Steve Collins basically swept the early rounds, he completely outboxed Eubank. He dropped Eubank in the 8th round with a body shot, sort of caught him off balance with a straight right to the body. And he basically schooled him. It was a technical domination. He schooled Chris Eubank. It was actually in the latter rounds of the fight where Collins started to slow down a bit because he'd expended a lot of energy with the way he was fighting, that Eubank actually started to have some success. And Eubank finished the fight very strongly. He dropped Steve Collins quite heavily in I believe it was the 10th round, with a straight right to the chin. And it looked like Steve Collins might get taken out. So I don't think it was a question of stamina or a question of Eubank being past his prime, because Eubank actually looked like the fresher guy in the later rounds of that fight. And it ended up being close on the scorecards, but Steve Collins clearly won the fight. It was a clear, wide decision victory as far as I'm concerned. It should have been a lot wider on the scorecards. And when they ultimately had a rematch, I think, I don't know how long it was later, but they had a rematch not long later. And the rematch wasn't even competitive. And again, the scoring was an absolute disgrace. It was a travesty. A disgraceful scoring. And in the rematch, the style that Steve Collins essentially brought to the table was completely different. He beat the shit out of Chris Eubank in the rematch. He actually went right at him and just swarmed him. There was no technique or no strategy from Steve Collins in the rematch. He just went right at Chris Eubank. He beat him up on the inside. He outworked him. He outmuscled him. And he was out to prove a point, because a lot of people said in the first fight that, Steve Collins was too negative, and if he'd have stood toe-to-toe, he would have got knocked out. So he wanted to prove people wrong, and he actually went forward and stood toe-to-toe with Eubank and outworked and outlanded him the whole fight, won every single round clearly. And again, the scoring was a travesty. One of the judges even had Eubank winning, and the two of them had, the two other judges had Steve Collins winning by a close decision. But it was a disgraceful scoring in that fight. And Chris Eubank was comprehensively beaten in both fights using different styles, and he didn't really gas out in either fight. If you look at both fights, Chris Eubank still showed pretty good stamina. He still showed a good chin. He was able to take shots from Steve Collins. Steve Collins wasn't really able to do any serious damage. So I don't buy this narrative that Eubank was somehow a shot fighter and that he would have smashed Steve Collins in his prime. I don't believe that. I actually think prime for prime, I would still favour Steve Collins. Because like I said, neither fight was really competitive. Okay, the first fight, yeah, both guys were on the canvas, but there was no clear rounds that Chris Eubank won. He was never able to outbox or outland, Steve Collins in any round of their fights. So I don't think that Eubank would have ever beaten Steve Collins. I think Steve Collins was just a better boxer than Eubank and a better fighter overall. Now, in regards to Nigel Benn, it's a little bit more interesting because Nigel Benn in the first fight against Steve Collins. Now Nigel Benn it was well known that he was pretty shot. I mean, even though it wasn't a matter of age, in Nigel Benn's case, I don't think that he was ever the same after the Gerald McClellan performance. But not only that, he had taken a lot of punches in his career, and he'd been in just back and forth brawls, throughout his whole entire career. So I definitely don't think that Benn was in perfect condition when he fought Steve Collins. And not only that, but Nigel Benn also suffered a foot injury in the first fight, and that was ultimately what ended the fight. It ended in the fourth round with Nigel Benn swinging himself off balance and ended up twisting his ankle, and he lost the fight by TKO because of the ankle injury. Now, it was well known going into that fight too that Nigel Benn was already retired. Nigel Benn had announced his retirement after getting beat up by Malinga, and he decided to come out of retirement to fight to fight Steve Collins. So I definitely agree there that Nigel Benn was past his prime, and I do think that a prime Nigel Benn would have made it more interesting. I'm not necessarily saying he would have beaten Steve Collins, because even in the rematch with Steve Collins was handily beating Nigel Benn, and Nigel Benn got pulled out by his corner. His trainer decided to pull him out after the sixth round, and he was taking a beating in that rematch. But I do think that a prime Nigel Benn, when he had more stamina, when he was more motivated, I think he would have given Steve Collins a really tough fight. I really do. I think that would have been a great fight. But when they did fight, he was too shot worn, and Steve Collins beat him. But that kind of makes me think, had Steve Collins fought Nigel Benn at his prime, that could have gone down as one of the best fights in boxing, man. It would have been an absolute war because the two guys were both extremely resilient and tough. But I still think, based on the versatility of a guy like Steve Collins, because Steve Collins proved in both the Eubank fights that he could outbox Eubank and he could beat Eubank going forward. So I do think personally that he was a better fighter than even a prime Nigel Benn, and I think he would have beaten him. Now, as for I do think he would have beaten Nigel Benn at his prime, but as for Roy Jones, now that's a different question, because that's the fighter that Steve Collins was so insistent that he would have beaten. Like I said, he was chasing Roy Jones for years. He wanted that fight, and he actually retired because he couldn't get that fight, and he didn't bother fighting Joe Calzaghe because it was the Roy Jones fight that he wanted. How do I think that fight would have gone? Personally, I think that Roy Jones would have beaten Steve Collins. I think Roy Jones was too fast, too sharp. Steve Collins would have, he would have given it a go. He would have come forward. I think he was a better fighter at super middleweight than he was at middleweight, like when he fought Reggie Johnson and whatnot. I think he improved a lot. He was a lot more filled out at super middleweight. He was a lot tougher, and he was a lot more resilient. But what I will say is that, and this is one thing I can't get out of my head, the people who dropped Steve Collins, if you look at the Eubank fight where he was dropped, but not only that, if you look at his final fight, which took place in Glasgow, which was a great fight, if you guys want to check it out, it's on YouTube. Steve Collins fought a guy called Craig Cummings, and he was dropped in that fight. He got dropped in the first 12 seconds of the first round. And he got up and he got his own back later in the same round. He scored his own knockdown, and he went on to break him down and stop him in the fourth round. But I think that being dropped by the likes of Eubank and Cummings, what that tells me is that Steve Collins would have been vulnerable very early on against Roy, because both of those knockdowns were at the beginning of a round. When he was dropped by Eubank, that was like in the first 20 seconds of the 10th round, and when he got dropped by by Cummings, like I mentioned, that was in like the first 12 seconds of the first round. So he was very vulnerable to be caught right out of the gate. You could catch Steve Collins cold, and I think that Roy Jones' style of being so cat quick and so accurate with those leaping hooks and stuff like that, I think Roy's speed and explosive power would have been too much. I think he would have knocked Steve Collins out. And I think he would have done so probably within 4 rounds, if I'm being honest. But if he couldn't get Steve Collins out in 4 rounds, then it could have been a hard, grueling fight for Roy. But I still think Roy would then find a way to win on points. He's just too fast and too skilled for Steve Collins, in my opinion. But it would have been interesting. Now, the fight that I find extremely interesting, and a fight that would have been so interesting, and I kind of do wish it happened, but it didn't. And that is, of course, in 1997 when he was set to fight Joe Calzaghe. Had that fight happened, how would that have been? How would that fight gone? I think that would have been a really interesting fight based on the timing of it. Now, obviously, Joe Calzaghe after that, several years later, went on to be one of the greatest British fighters of all time and one of the best super middleweights of all time. But going into that fight, let's not forget where both of these guys were at in their careers and how both of them were perceived. Steve Collins was a seasoned champion who had several title defenses, which included 2 fights against Chris Eubank and 2 fights against Nigel Benn. So he'd had a good run as super middleweight champion, and he was very experienced. He'd shown great stamina, he'd shown a good chin at world level, and he had shown an ability to adapt and adjust and fight different styles and fight different strategies. And he'd shown a lot of heart and resilience. Joe Calzaghe, on the other hand, going into that fight, hadn't really done much yet. If you look at Calzaghe's career prior to that, he'd pretty much blown everybody away. He was fighting journeymen and domestic level contenders and knocking them out in a couple of rounds. I believe he did have one fight at cruiserweight, which was against was that against Eubank's cousin? I believe it was, yeah, and he went the distance. But other than that, when he was fighting at super middleweight, he'd blown everybody away early. He had a bunch of early knockouts, and he hadn't really fought anybody at world level yet. And that was why when he fought Eubank, and let's not forget that Eubank took the fight on 13 days' notice because Steve Collins pulled out. Eubank was dropped in the first round by Calzaghe and was comprehensively outboxed. But in the later rounds of that fight, Eubank actually did start to bust Calzaghe up a bit, and he stunned him a couple of times and actually won the 12th round against Calzaghe. That kind of makes me think if Calzaghe at that stage of his career fought Steve Collins, I think that would have been a really tough fight for Calzaghe. And I actually, in retrospect, and my mind changes about this from time to time, I think in retrospect, Steve Collins might have beaten Calzaghe. Now, I'm not saying he's a better fighter than Calzaghe. I think a prime Calzaghe wrecks him. I think a prime Calzaghe from a couple years later, where he had more 12-round experience, he would have completely schooled and outboxed Steve Collins and maybe even stopped him. But definitely at least a wide decision. Calzaghe would have won by far. But at that stage of both of their careers, I think I would make Steve Collins the favourite, because Steve Collins definitely had a lot left in the tank, more so than Eubank, because even though he was older than Eubank, he just was more committed at that time in his career than Eubank was. And of course, we saw what he did against Eubank. He did a better job against Eubank, at least in the second fight, than what Calzaghe did when he fought Eubank. So I think that Steve Collins, and that was a better version of Eubank too, it was less shot worn. So I think, in retrospect, I personally think that Steve Collins would have beaten Joe Calzaghe. And I think he would have beaten Joe Calzaghe on points in a close fight. He might have gotten off to a bad start. He might have even got dropped early in the fight, like he was against Cummings and like Calzaghe did to Eubank. But I think Steve Collins' resilience and Steve Collins' experience would have, sort of correlated and added to him being able to figure a way to win the fight, personally. But that's just speculation. I could be wrong about that. Maybe that version of Calzaghe would have beaten him. Maybe Calzaghe would have beaten any version of Steve Collins. I really don't know. It's all speculation. Maybe I was wrong about Roy Jones. Maybe Collins was a decent enough fighter to get the win. I doubt it. But that's just how I see it, man. What do you guys think about Steve Collins? Was Steve Collins a world-class fighter? Who would have won if he and Roy Jones had fought in 2013 when Roy was at the end of his career and Collins was thinking of coming out of retirement? Who would have won then? Now, obviously, we don't know who would have won then because we don't know what condition Steve Collins was in. But had he been in good condition, and if he'd have still been training over the years, you never know. He might have been able to give Roy a tough fight. I doubt it, but you never know. But overall, my assessment of Steve Collins is I think he's criminally underrated. I think he's a good fighter. Again, I don't put him on the same level as somebody like Roy Jones or Joe Calzaghe at their prime, but I do think he was a good fighter, and I do think I think retrospectively he's a very interesting fighter to talk about. And thinking of his career in retrospect, it was an interesting one that made him somewhat underrated because, like I said, he had a few losses at middleweight earlier in his career, which I think sort of made people underestimate him and think he was an easy fight. But I mean, it's like when Chris Eubank was in that interview, he clearly stated that he was shocked that Steve Collins was able to beat him. So I find that quite interesting. Again, I recommend you go and watch that face off or that gloves are off between them, and I recommend you go and watch some of Steve Collins' fights because he was very entertaining and very interesting to watch. So let me know what you guys think. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for some predictions. I've got some predictions coming. Thanks for watching. God bless.